Okay, welcome everyone. I'd like to call to order the May 20th, 2021 meeting of the Bellingham Planning Commission. Heather, will you please call the roll?
Scott Jones.
Here.
Rose Lathrop.
Here.
Ollie Taishi.
Here.
Jed Ballou.
Here.
Mike Estes.
Here.
Victor Crissetti.
Here. Here. Man.
Oh, yeah, you're good.
Yep.
We had a set of minutes that were sent out from May 6th. If there's no discussion or opposition, unless anyone objects, we'll just go ahead and consider those approved. Any comments on the meetings from May 6th? Nope. Okay, those minutes are approved. Tonight, we have one item on the agenda. It is a public hearing on the RM project. We have a draft ordinance which will be presented by staff. We'll take public comment on that draft ordinance, and then the commissioners will discuss that and possibly take action. Before we get into the public hearing, we'll do a general public comment. So if any public attendees tonight want to speak to us on a topic other than the residential multi reform we're doing the public hearing on in just a minute. We'll do any public comment right now on a general topic. Just use the Zoom raise your hand function. Going once. Looks like we got a couple. Heather, can you bring them in?
Go ahead, Nabel.
Sorry, I just joined in. Are we talking about City View now?
No, this is just a
different
public
night.
Sorry for
comment.
that. So, okay, sorry.
Go ahead, Carolyn.
Hi, my name is Carolyn, and I am a new resident here to Bellingham. And what I'd like to say is, with regards to moving here, part of it is for services for my children with disabilities. And I thought I had an ADU here. And it turns out that not only doesn't have an ADU that was licensed, but they also now believe that it's within the watershed. And based on that, I've done more research on this, and it's something the city really needs to consider is the qualifications for doing an ADU. They are very restrictive. I need to basically inform people within 500 feet that I need a place for my son with disabilities to live. The building's already here. It was already a bakery with 3 sinks and 2 stoves. And now they are making it extremely difficult. And I may not actually be able to have an ADU for him, even though there was a bakery here before. And I think it's really important that Bellingham look more in depth at ADUs so that we can provide housing for our family with special needs, for the elderly, and that Bellingham look at how it is being done in other cities in Washington State, such as Seattle and Tacoma. And neither of those cities require that there be public, that the public be told about making an ADU. And I think that I would like Bellingham to examine that more closely. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. Any other public comment tonight? Virginia?
Yeah, I don't know how to turn, anyways, I'm a homeowner in the Roosevelt neighborhood, and I would like to build an ADU. My entire neighborhood is already zoned as multifamily. And I just think without more proactive incentives and making it easier for existing single family and homeowners to build ADUs, you're just gonna feed gentrification. Gentrification happens unless there is proactive intervention. So that's what I have to say. Please create some incentives and make it easier for people to build ADUs.
Thank you, Virginia. I don't see any other hands, Mike.
Okay, no other hands are up. We'll close the general public comment and move into our public hearing. Mr. Ockett, are you leading us off tonight?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening. Actually, Lisa Poole is going to take us through the initial parts of the staff recommendation, and others will join in at appropriate times. So Lisa, go ahead.
Thanks, Greg. Let me just share my screen here for the presentation. Okay, does that look normal? Presentation mode and everything? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, looks good.
All right, great. I will go through this first part, and I'll be sharing the presentation with Kate Newell, Senior GIS Analyst, and Kurt Nabafel of our office. So good evening again, Lisa Poole, Senior Planner. I'm joined by the rest of our RM team, which is Kate Newell, Greg Ockett, Kurt Nabafeld, and Kathy Bell, and Rick Suppler, Planning Director, is also here tonight. We're here to provide you with a brief overview of the project purpose and main components of the residential multi or RM project. Then we'll open it up for the hearing and take your questions. Just a quick refresher on the purpose of the project is to simplify the RM code and achieve intended densities in RM zones as outlined in the comprehensive plan, as many of these areas are underdeveloped. The project includes changes to several neighborhood plans and several sections of the Bellingham Municipal Code, including the RM chapter and zoning tables. These changes are reflected in the draft ordinance that is part of your packet tonight. The project scope includes these three main components: expanding infill housing toolkit forms in RM duplex zones, a range zoning system, and minimum densities. These are all applicable only in RM zones. We'll go through each of these in more detail on the following slides. As a reminder, we've met virtually with several groups and have sought input via a survey on Engage Bellingham. Notes from the open house and other comments are posted on Engage Bellingham and the city's RM webpage. We've also held several work sessions and public hearings with the Planning Commission and the City Council during the docketing process and also leading up to this hearing. Most comments to date have been clarifying questions about what the project may or may not include, or commentary related to the housing crisis. And the staff report includes more information on public comments and staff's responses. The first component is the infill toolkit. All RM zones currently allow all infill housing toolkit forms, except that the RM duplex zone only allows those forms in green. Staff is proposing allowing all toolkit forms in RM duplex zones. We're also proposing to change the name of RM duplex zones to RM transition zones to better reflect the housing forms proposed for these areas. The second component is a range zoning system. Comparable comp plan ranges would be assigned to RM areas per the densities listed in the zoning tables in the Bellingham Municipal Code. In this example, the sub-area's current density of 4,000 square feet per unit falls within the medium range in the land use chapter. Under the proposal, development in this sub-area could occur at a density between 3,600 square feet per unit and 7,200 square feet per unit. This is another example of range zoning. This is a portion of the zoning table for sub-area 9 in the King Mountain neighborhood, which includes both medium and high densities currently. Staff is proposing to designate an area such as this as medium, but higher densities are still achievable with existing density bonus systems. Next, I'll pass it to Kate Newell to review minimum densities.
Thanks, Lisa. So the third component of this project is minimum densities. The previous two project components we just reviewed provide opportunities for compact growth, but it's the application of the minimum densities that ensure the opportunities are utilized. Minimum densities allow us to achieve the intended densities to support these goals. Next slide, Lisa. So as a refresher, minimum densities establish the minimum number of units or type of development allowed on a property. They set the minimum level of development intensity on the land. Since we last met with the commission, we've made a change to include minimum for the low range. Planning Commission had previously commented on the low category and the low densities not really being appropriate in the multifamily zones. So based on those comments and the low development capacity in these areas, we've decided to include a minimum for those two areas, for the low area. You can see on the graph here. So as an example of what minimum densities are trying to achieve, here's a 1 acre site. Again, we currently only have maximums established in our zoning tables. So there's no minimum requirement right now for minimum number of units. This example shows how a property in the RM zone could be underdeveloped. With minimums established in this example of the 1 acre parcel on a land in a medium zone, the developer would be required to build a minimum of 6 units. This can include a variety of housing types to meet that minimum density based on gross density. Some of the concerns we heard regarding minimum densities is that we would only see apartment type development. In our last meeting, we showed you several real life examples of projects that could meet the proposed minimum requirements with a variety of housing forms. This is an example of a project currently in application for 63 units on 11.3 acres. About half of the site is encumbered with critical areas and associated setbacks. If this project were in a medium zone, the maximum potential units would be 136 units. If we were to apply a gross density minimum of 7,200 square feet per unit, the required minimum number of units would be 68 units. So you can see here with just a mix of single family, townhome, and small house forms from the infill toolkit, that they're only 5 units short of meeting that minimum density. This could easily be achieved with a couple denser housing forms such as duplex or triplex. Next slide. So again, through our analysis and research that we've done, we feel like utilizing the ranges and maintaining the application of maximums and minimums as gross densities is the appropriate option for this component. And I will pass it over to Kurt.
Great. Thank you, Kate. Got that sticky mute button, got me on that one. We also understand that we need to have exceptions to some of the minimums that we've established. We understand that there will be situations that the minimum density will just not be able to be achieved. And because of that, we've proposed several exceptions to these requirements. The first one is to allow redevelopment of an existing single-family residence when it's 50% or more destroyed, provided that the rebuild does not preclude the ability to achieve that minimum density in the future. So we'll allow that redevelopment to occur or that rebuild to occur, but we want to make sure that it's in an appropriate area that you could still add on and meet those minimum densities at a later date. We also understand that there are special circumstances associated with properties, such as size or shape of a property that may not or make it a lot more difficult to meet those minimums. So we've included regulations in there to allow for those special circumstances. And then obviously in Bellingham, we know that many of our areas include critical areas. So if the property is wholly or substantially encumbered with a critical area such as a wetland, we understand it may be harder to achieve those minimums. And so we wanted to build in that exception or that ability to go through that exception process. We also want to make sure that we maintain our historic resources. Some of our established neighborhoods have some listed historic resources, whether they're listed on the national, the state, or the local historic registers. We want to make sure that those houses can be maintained. So if meeting the minimum density would require an alteration or maybe a removal of that historic resource or even affect the integrity of the site, we want to be able to provide an out for folks here so that we can still maintain those special and unique structures in our community. We're also including a limitation on the number of detached single-family units. One of our goals that Lisa mentioned earlier was to, in order to ensure a mix of housing choice, we're proposing that standard detached single-family units are limited to 25% of the total units allowed on a site. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't do more single-family types. You could do infill toolkit single-family, such as smaller lots. So those are still allowed. They're not counted towards the 25%. And it's really only that standard detached single-family. And to help clarify that, we've added a definition of detached single-family unit to differentiate between a toolkit single-family and a standard detached single-family unit. We also are looking at some changes to some height standards. Currently, development occurring at a density of 1,500 square feet or greater is allowed to build to 45 feet. Buildings at a lower density, such as 2,000 square feet, are limited to 35 feet. Because both of these densities now fall into that high density category, we're proposing to allow a height of 45 feet in this category. And we believe that should help accommodate the minimum density. And we also understand or think that our design review guidelines will ensure appropriate transition and scale of the new buildings in these areas. We're also looking at some minor changes to further the project purpose. We've made several formatting changes and edits to simplify the code to make it more user-friendly. One of the things that we find helps a lot when you're reading very complex codes is to have it in a table format. So our new residential multi-chapter will have more tables there. We've also created new definitions to ensure that the code is able to be applied appropriately. And as Lisa mentioned, we're changing the duplex qualifier to a transition qualifier to more accurately reflect the uses that are now allowed in that zone. We've consolidated the residential multi-codes into a single section. Before we had a planned residential section and a multifamily residential section, and now we've kind of combined those into one. We've also clarified the residential multi-regulations in our land division ordinance. Ultimately, we believe the codes will help achieve the project goals, and we also understand that this is a starting point for discussion on some of these components. But again, we believe that these codes will increase housing choice and options and ensure our residential multi-zones are built to appropriate densities. And remember, that was our charge out of the gate for this project. So we believe the codes that we've drafted are definitely meeting those project goals. Next slide, please. So we also understand that there's a lot of information in this packet. Codes can be very challenging and sometimes hard to digest. Many of our land use codes are very technical in nature. So we also realized that the packet was just released last week. So many people may not have that opportunity to fully review it. So we plan on continuing the hearing to the June 10th Planning Commission meeting. Depending on how much comment we get tonight, maybe we can look at modifying that and just turn that June 10th into a work session. But we did want to make sure that we left the opportunity for everyone to participate in this process because it is so important. So as I've mentioned, we'll have a potential additional work session that comes beyond that. The next steps for the Planning Commission is that they will listen to the public hearing, the comments, and ask staff questions, review the draft codes, and ultimately the Planning Commission will make a recommendation on the draft ordinance to the City Council. City Council then holds its own public hearing on the process and will likely hold work sessions and then ultimately adopt the codes for this project. I believe that's it. That's the last slide. So we're able to answer any of the questions that you may have right now, or if you choose to go to open the public comment and start taking testimony, we're happy to follow that as well.
Okay, if commissioners have like clarifying comments or anything like that, we could do a few of that right now. Otherwise, I think we'll go straight into the public part. Go ahead, Rose.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the RM transition zones, just to get better understanding. So what makes the RM transition zones different than, say, an RM medium or low, or are they one of those?
They'll actually be one of those, the transition zone. So our zoning is set up with residential single zoning, residential multi-zoning, commercial, and industrial. And then in each of those, we have use qualifiers. So in the RM zone, we have a residential multi-transition zone, and a residential multi-multiple zone, and a residential planned zone. So those are three different categories. And within each of those categories, you can also have the range densities. So you'll have a residential transition zone that has high, medium, or low. And you'll also have the residential multi-zones that will have a high, medium, or low category.
And so there's other requirements or development regulations that apply to those three different areas.
Correct. Yeah. And ultimately, the biggest change to that residential what was known as the duplex zone, it's now the transition zone, and we're allowing all of the toolkit forms in that zone now, whereas they were limited before.
Thank you.
Jed, your hands up.
So I'm a little bit new to this group, so maybe I'm catching up to speed a little bit, but I did look at the last meetings on this topic, so hopefully I'm caught up to some degree. The thing that I'm curious about was in going with the gross area for minimums, what does the process look like if you have a really atypical site with a lot of encumbrances where you've got a very small percentage of developable land? What's the process look like to go astray from what the zoning code would say as far as the minimum?
Well, that would be that exception process that we talked about. So if you've got a lot of substantial wetlands or critical areas on that, there may be outs for you through that exception process. We also believe one of the reasons that we went with the gross is to be consistent with all of our other zones. Currently, when we calculate density or the number of units that are allowed on a piece of property, it's based on gross density or gross land area versus net. I'll let maybe Kate can elaborate a little bit more on this, but it's really intended to help us with our housing form. So you may not be able to meet that gross density with just a standard one type of housing form. So you may have to use a couple duplexes or some townhomes, maybe a triplex and some of those smaller lots, as well as the single family to meet that minimum. So we're trying to get a mix of housing forms within that area. And we believe sticking with that gross and having those sections if needed will help us. Kate, do you have more that you'd like to add on that?
Sure. I would just say the comp plan ranges as they're set up right now were intended to be applied as a gross density, not as a net density. So that's how they were established with the 0 to 3599 and 3600 to 7200. Those were initially intended to be a gross density. It's easier to take that entire parcel of land and figure out what is expected in terms of units than to kind of reverse engineer it with the net density. Net densities are easy to understand when you're thinking about single family and minimum lot sizes. So in terms of multifamily, that gross density we feel like is really the most appropriate application and sticking with those identified comp plan ranges.
Scott, you're up next.
In relation to Rose's question, getting back to understanding the transition a little bit better, you mentioned about the transition, another form of zoning, and then the planned zone. I forget the middle one. Could you do an example of what a high rating of density would be in a transition zone versus the planned zone? And could it be the exact same type of building, or because there's more of the infill toolkit in the transition zone, those kinds of high density buildings would be different than the other locations, the other zoned areas?
Yeah, actually, it really comes down to the development regulations. The development regulations in our plan zones are a little bit different than the development regulations in our residential multiple zones. The densities can apply to all of those. So in all different use qualifiers, so in the transition zone, in the plan zone, and in the multiple zone, you can have high, medium, and low density categories within their properties. So that high, medium, and low will transcend all of the use qualifiers. The duplex, what were originally known as duplex zones, were intended to have kind of this smaller scale and be a transition area from some of these higher residential multiple zones. So you take these much higher density multiple areas, transition through a duplex zone or old duplex zone, now transition zone, into maybe a single family zone or a commercial zone. So they're really kind of that in between that really intense high multifamily and that lower density standard single family. So that's why we modified the name to be transition zone, but you can still have the same level. You're likely not to have the same scale. So in a residential transition zone, you're not going to have a large apartment complex. Whereas in a residential multiple zone, you would have that larger scale apartment complex.
And is that because the properties are smaller in the transition zones, or what would be stopping someone from, because I noticed there was a transition high level in one of the neighborhoods, what would be stopping someone from putting in an apartment in a high level transition zone, just for me to get the nuance?
Yeah, it's in each of our zones, we've got a permitted uses section, and in the transition zones, apartments are not allowed.
Thank you.
Back to Jed.
Yeah, does an ADU count as a unit in your counts?
An ADU does not count against the density.
Okay, why don't we take this time and switch gears to the public comment part of the hearing. So attendees from the public side, put your Zoom hand up now and we'll come and get through you in order. Heather, can you bring in the first comment?
Go ahead, Nabel Kamel.
Thank you. I appreciate the work that was done in this project, and I have a question and maybe a follow-up clarification. The first question is, I'm looking at the map and I was wondering what's the logic behind selecting these different areas? Can you hear me?
Go ahead with your whole comment, and then staff will address those questions at the very end, all at the same time.
Okay, so it's a comment. So my comment basically is that I don't understand the logic behind selecting particular areas and not others, and whether it has taken into consideration lot sizes and the effect of, and we have projects that emerge in areas that are single-family units currently, and that will have definitely a kind of a different character than the existing typologies and character of the neighborhood. So to what extent this has been taken into consideration to maintain some of the quality of the neighborhoods that might not have the historic character and the kind of property value that is seen in other parts, but nevertheless are valuable to their communities that have that don't want to see in their communities a kind of a detrimental impact on the kind of the properties. So I'm just wondering how this map came about. That's my question and comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Michael. Michael Shavario, you'll have to unmute.
There, can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the staff for modifying the minimum densities and adding minimum densities to all three of the categories. I'm very much in favor of densification, and I'm also very much an advocate for affordability, particularly permanent affordability. The GMA and the comp plan both call for all planning efforts to account for affordability to meet the needs of a community and equitability as well. As we all know, those two things are very tied together. And the one thing that this densification doesn't do, and probably is not intended to do, is to deal with the affordability question, except so much as it is affected by supply and demand, which, as we all know right now, supply and demand doesn't seem to matter all that much with the current dynamics of the housing sales that are going on in Bellingham right now. But in my view, all the areas densified should be required to have 50% of the homes permanently affordable with the densification project. And I know that there's all kinds of objections and reasons why people think that that's impossible, but I think that should be a goal. We should be looking for money to help nonprofits do that and provide incentives and whatever other methods that can make it easier for builders to provide to build 50% permanent affordability homes in areas that are densified from what they are now. Because otherwise we're just giving value away for people to develop homes that still won't be affordable for most working people in Bellingham. The policy number LU4 in the comp plan talks about, quote, a unique character. And I don't think that shouldn't be interpreted to mean eliminate changes to neighborhoods that are evolving. That is, neighbors shouldn't be able to say, our neighborhood has this character, because the fact is all neighborhoods are evolving, and we need to consider that when we talk about unique character and how we interpret policy LU4. And my last comment is the staff. I was reading the staff responses to some of the public written comments so far, and the staff response to the question of affordability concerns said something like this, quote, multifamily smaller units have the potential to be more affordable. And that I think that is true, but once again, it's not enough. The potential to be more affordable in the high hopes that the law of supply and demand is going to solve our affordability problem is just not going to cut it. despite all the efforts that you folks have been putting into this, we need to make much more aggressive efforts to make homes permanently affordable for folks. And this is just not enough. It is good work, but we have to really focus on that affordability question. So I think I've made my point, and thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you, Michael. Go ahead, Derek Long, you're ready.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Thanks for your work on a Sunday night for staff and Planning Commission. My name's Derek Long, 1510 J Street. I serve on the Whatcom Housing Alliance Policy Committee as well as the steering committee. And the Whatcom Housing Alliance and its members have been tracking this residential multi-project since it was first introduced to City Council in August of 2019. We've been making contributions to ideas all along the way, and we've always held that this RM project has the potential to add many much needed homes to our community. The Housing Alliance letter of support is already in public record. It's been filed for months, and we continue to stand by it. One line in particular I'll read, changes to the land use code to facilitate the uses envisioned by for RM zones have the potential to not only result in more homes of all shapes and sizes, but it can advance the many goals and policies of our comprehensive plan, including those related to small scale, context-sensitive housing, climate change, and land use. Kudos to the staff report included in this packet. It makes a great case for supporting this new ordinance. And we're encouraging you to make a strong and quick recommendation to City Council to pass the ordinance. And I think I still have more time. I'd also like to just share personally that I live at 1510 J Street. I'm 1 block away from 85 still newer homes in 2 apartment buildings on the corner of Broadway and DuPont. 85 new homes, well over 100 new neighbors, and they've done nothing but add energy and vitality and fun to our neighborhood. Many of my neighbors were concerned about parking, and yet 2.5 years later, we all can still find a parking spot right in front of our home. They were worried about noise. They were worried about how trash and recycling were going to be handled, and everything's going great. I'd recommend, everyone can come to my home and let me tour you around to see how great it is to have these new neighbors on my block and in my neighborhood. Just the other day, a mother of 2 who lives in one of those apartments stopped by, noticing that I have 2 energetic young kids bouncing around the yard, and donated a little trampoline for my young ones because her 2 kids needed a trampoline during the lockdown. They're 4 and 6, and they're a little too big for it now. And just want to share that very neighborly and fun little story about how awesome it is to have these new people in our neighborhood, and we'll take more. And the last thing I'll say is thousands of people in our community, just like the over 100 people who live in these new homes near me, expect us to hustle. They need our help. And so the last thing I'll say is let's hustle on this and get on to the next thing and hustle on that so we can really provide some relief to people. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Carrie Veldman, go ahead.
Good evening. I'm here tonight to advocate my support for the RM zone project. I believe this update will simplify the zoning code and also foster the density outline in our comprehensive plan. Whether we're in a housing crisis or not, this update I think will be beneficial to our growth as a city. I've been working with city staff to understand what this update entails for our properties as a local development firm. And in review of the materials, this is a very specific situation that the literature discusses high density residential as areas best suited with robust infrastructure and services, parks and trails. However, Area 11 of the Cordata neighborhood meets all of those criteria and is outlined in the map and text to be a high-density residential area. However, the zoning table language still references the density called out in the relic that is the Cordata PUD. This governing document states Area 11 is designated with 18 units per acre. This particular property has no traffic issues, critical areas have been solved and successfully mitigated for, and it's adjacent to a mixed-use commercial zone. In order to best serve that mixed-use commercial area, higher density is needed in Area 11, and we'd like the opportunity to explore what we can do with more density. We are next to also the Cordata Park, so it's the perfect spot to see that, that opportunity flourish. My request to the Planning Commission is to ask city staff that the zoning table language should be revised to be consistent with the remaining RM project updates and reflect a high-density residential designation for Area 11 of the Cordata neighborhood. That is all.
Thank you, Carrie. Ralph Black, go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you, Planning Commission members. I'm Ralph Black, Alliance Properties. We're one of the largest landowners and home providers in the King Mountain Area 13, and we've been following this proposal since the emergency ordinance came out. And as of today, we are already feeling some significant impacts from this ordinance as to our ability to provide housing moving forward. We provided several written comments as well as examples to the Planning Commission and expressing our concerns in 3 areas. I want to talk briefly about them tonight in light of some of what staff has said. Our first area is the 25% max single family. As stated by several staff members tonight in the prelude and even in discussing this area, first and foremost is to utilize these RM areas at capacities that are in the city's comprehensive plan so that we don't have to sprawl out into further areas and we're getting utilization in these areas that we intended. To that end, the minimum density was added, and I'll talk about that later on pages 36. Our concern is that there is no need to place a housing type limiter on these areas. If the density is reached, the housing type should be irrelevant. Kurt testified that they want to get a mixed use, and that's the reason they've done this, and that we can use the infill toolkit to fill in some of these areas on SFR. That would be fine, except the infill toolkit's very difficult to use. I think we've got some examples in there showing that it actually uses up more land to create the same number of units. And if their intent is to use infill toolkit and greenfield development, then let's first change the infill toolkit. Otherwise, let's simply amend this section to say any and all housing types that are allowed in the infill toolkit are also allowed without using the infill toolkit. The other concern that we have is that there's a lot of factors beyond just housing types that you have to determine when trying to figure out what you're going to provide. It's financing, where the market is, and the builder developer needs as much flexibility as possible. Thirdly, the single family and greenfield development in particular pays for the infrastructure. When you're extending roads and sewer lines and trails and bike trails and roads, you've got to have the revenue necessary to pay for all those developments, infrastructure developments up front. You can't add those into multi because of rent rates. You can't add them into smaller homes because of the cost of smaller homes. You need the flexibility of providing enough single family residential that can pay for these infrastructure costs to be able to provide the other housing types. Finally, where does 25% come from? I think we have some examples of a project we have right now that has different housing types, has multi, has et cetera, but it's at 28%. So it wouldn't be allowed. So we'd have to go and renegotiate with the staff to get a variance or a departure to go at lower, or we'd have to change housing types to get it down to 25%. There's no magic in the number 25%. If you set it at 50%, set it at some other number if it's necessary. We don't believe it's necessary. Simply allow all the housing types or just as I'm about to talk about, make sure we're meeting the minimum densities. Our second area of concern is minimum density, not the concept of minimum density. We support the concept of minimum density. As discussed by staff earlier on, it's whether you're calculating net usable or whether you're calculating gross. One of the staff members, I'm sorry, I don't know which one, indicated that, well, in coming up with the new high, medium, and low, they had considered some of the unusability and have derived at lower densities in some areas to sort of get toward a net buildable. Our concern is that, no, you still have a whole bunch of factors that are beyond the housing provider's control, such as wetlands, buffers, open space, parks, storm ponds, et cetera, that are all code related and are not in any way in the control of the builder developer. They're all identified early in the process, so it's easy for everybody to understand. We appreciate that on page 36, section B, C, and D, staff recognized this and provided a pathway for exemptions. What we're saying is, unfortunately, that pathway requires another process of application, director's approval, can be approved with or without conditions, will cause for a further extension in the process and an additional cost on it. If staff recognizes, as we do, that these areas, in fact, are these situations, critical areas, parks, et cetera, are impacting what is the buildable, the net buildable, let's simply take the section B, C, and D and not make it exemption, but just make it part of the code, that all of these areas are subtracted to arrive at what the buildable pad is. And then finally, it's there is a 50% of single family, no more than 50% of single family can be constructed in any single phase. It's more confusing. It may be something that we can understand later on, but there again, it appears confusing to us. If the preliminary plat meets the minimum density codes and meets all that's necessary to move forward, then what we build and at what stage we build it shouldn't necessarily be of any concern, because it will all eventually get built out. Example, although this is a bad example because it happens to be in the middle of the town and surrounded and not greenfields, is we were the developers behind the new Fairhaven clock tower, and that site sat for 30 years before we actually built on it, but it eventually got built. Everything will eventually get used up in these areas. I'm done.
That's done. Sorry, I can't make my timer stop. Did you have a final comment, Ralph?
One quick final comment just was thank you. And flexibility is the key to making this work, because if we can't work it between the people providing houses, nothing is going to move forward.
Thank you. I don't have any more hands. Is there anyone else who'd like to address the commission this evening? I don't see anybody, Mike.
Okay. Does staff have any immediate responses to any of the comments we heard? Some of those weightier ones I'm sure we'll discuss and have a back and forth, but were there any questions that you jumped out at wanting to address?
Well, Nabil had a question about the logic behind the selecting the areas. And it's pretty simple. It's really just the existing residential multi-zones. That map, that's what they are. And we selected those specifically because they've been underdeveloped.
I think the only thing that I would add to that, onto Lisa's comment, is we worked with the existing land use and zoning maps. We did not and are not proposing to change any boundaries of any existing land use areas. And so the map, I will agree with you, is confusing. And there are a lot of sub areas, and but that's just that's our starting place of where we are now. So just understand that we are not proposing any revisions to those sub areas at this particular time.
Okay, let's turn it over for the commissioner's discussion. Who wants to go first? Ollie, jump in.
Thanks, Mike. I have a number of questions, and I don't want to go through them all in a row by any means. So I guess I'll wait, because I think some of them will be, couched in some of the things we heard, some of the themes. And I'm wondering, I guess my first question for staff is, it sounds like we may extend public hearing, or we will be extending public hearing to our next meeting.
Yeah, I think because of the short time period that the packet has been out, we would encourage you to continue the hearing. And then if there isn't a lot of additional comment on June 10th, we can go right into work session and start discussing the issues that have been raised both tonight and from the public, and then from the commission as well. So if any of the commissioners have questions, or there are things that aren't clear to you, if there's some areas where you would like us to do a little additional research, that's kind of what we're looking for at this point. And then we can get into some of the more detailed comments when we get to the work session.
Thanks, Greg. That's I had what I described as like wonky questions about how certain pieces of code worked, and I didn't want to bore everybody with them, and thought it would be appropriate to maybe write an email, and then you could be prepared to respond to at the work session.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. I have other comments, but that was just thinking about the types of things. So I guess my comment for the moment is that, and this is kind of just a big, broad question. There's a number of points in the staff report where we talk about this evidence of properties being significantly underdeveloped, and that being kind of like a basis for why we're pursuing this. And I'm wondering if is that based on like an analysis that was done, like in the GIS department or something, where you actually looked at the development projects that have occurred in our RM zones, juxtapose them against this concept of the ranges, and we're able to determine that developments have been occurring like below what our minimums would be, for example?
Yeah, we've done that analysis. Our initial analysis really just looked across the board at all types of uses in our RM zones. And we saw there's a pretty even amount, about 31% were used for multifamily, about 25% were currently being used as single family, and then, another, say 25% of vacant land, and then sort of some commercial and public sprinkled in there. And then when we look at how much land each of those uses is taking up, it's pretty significant, right? Like the multifamily, a lot more units on basically the same amount of land as single family, but we're getting a third of the amount of units. So that's kind of just looking across the board. If we look at some of our more recent developments, especially up in the northern end, we are seeing it being significantly under what that range would be for the category. And then we also have, those are sort of our larger kind of greenfield examples. And we do have some infill examples where people may be underdeveloping their properties, where it would be ideal in these RM zones that they, build more than 3 single family homes, that we get a mix of uses in these RM zones and the infill situations.
Okay, thank you.
Rose?
Yeah, I would like to hear more from you guys about the restriction on single family residential. I'm a big fan of the infill toolkit, except for that it needs to be reworked. I think it's been on the city work plan since I started at Sustainable Connections at least 9 years ago. So curious about, I very much appreciate the work that you guys have done on this RM project. And I hope that there's a plan to follow up with revisions to the infill toolkit to make it more user-friendly. And so why the restriction on single family residential and a push to the toolkit?
I do have to chime in. Appreciate that comment, Rose. And actually, as soon as we get done with the RM, it's the very next project that we're looking at handling. So the toolkit, some changes are on their way.
I'll jump in for a second. You asked about why are we concerned on single family? Because the patterns we've seen in a number of the residentially multi-zoned, long-term residential multi-zone land has been they've developed at lower densities and they precluded the result we really hoped for, which is the higher density for the properties themselves. Single family is not inappropriate if the densities could be met. Unfortunately, we have a number of developments in town that promise to get higher density, included on their plats areas that were going to have the higher density development, built the single family first, and that's all that ever got built. So what we're trying to find a way is we understand and we're very sensitive that you do need to do single family. It is a marketable commodity and it helps the cash flow. It pays for the infrastructure. And we understand it might have to lead. We just want to be sure somewhere in the process that the promised multifamily units actually realize and come to the ground. And trying to provide a limit is to try to reserve that and prevent the wholesale development of areas at lower density that would become built-in opponents for the higher density that subsequently would come.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Jed?
Kind of a general philosophical question just about home ownership. And as we increase density, if we don't see increase in like condominiums and that type of setup, like what do you see as being kind of like the long-term future of ownership of your residence as the city develops?
Well, I will just say, I mean, then and other team members can chime in, but many of those toolkit forms can be ownership forms. Like the townhomes, for example, can be ownership form.
You know, we're going to need some help on condominiums. The legislature, not this immediate session, but the prior session last year, started down that road. Unfortunately, the nature of condominium associations has been that they all end up litigating the builder. For whatever reason, that seems to be the case. And it may not be representative of the broad nature of the ownership, but it does seem to represent those on the board. Legislature changed the law and said that you had to have the association briefed before any action is entertained on. Additionally, it's to provide remedy for it. Because right now there are very few condominiums moving forward because of the liability issue. If we could solve that, and that's going to take a legislative fix, that's a form of ownership that's excellent and makes a lot of sense for us to move forward. There are other models too that could potentially work. This proposal before you today doesn't really deal with ownership, but we'd like to see developing in the city over time a broader use of the tools to provide better opportunities for home ownership for folks. And especially as Lisa said on point, the units that are smaller that could be more easily conveyed with zero lot line or other means.
Let's go to Victor.
There we go. Yeah, I just wanted to circle back to the low density multifamily. We're talking about putting a minimum density cap or floor on it. I'm just wondering, before this, was it unforeseen that those areas were going to be underdeveloped? It just seems very discretionary on if it is built with single family or multifamily without any minimum floor in it.
Can you maybe clarify that a little? I'm trying to fully understand.
As it is right now with the low density, that there's no minimum density on it, it sounds like it being underdeveloped and that a lot of single family projects are going on. I'm just curious to know, was it unforeseen without having the minimum density on there that so many single family projects were going to happen?
Yeah, I think, historically, again, which Kathy had mentioned and others too tonight, is that we're not changing any of the zoning designations tonight or with this proposal. We're just changing the way that it potentially is developed. So many of these, the zoning is very historic. It's been around for a very, very long time. Many of the areas that we're looking at tonight have been zoned this density level since the 1980s, the early 1980s, when we adopted our first neighborhood plans. So those densities have been around for quite some time. And I think what we're finding is, as the city is growing, we need to be able to provide more opportunity, more housing choice. And historically, some of these areas have just been underdeveloped. They're only built with these single family zones, and they're built at that low density. Currently, we do not have minimums anywhere in our city. And that's one main component of this project, is to finally establish those minimums so that we're assured that that number of units are actually taking place in the areas that were always intended to have that higher density.
All right. Thank you.
Let's go back to Ollie.
Thanks, Mike. I just wanted to circle back to Rose's comment about the 25% limitation. I think, Rick, what you said about ensuring that the multifamily gets built seems like it correlates primarily to the 50% phasing threshold and ensuring that a mixed design is built with some of each type. And Rose made the comment, why the push to infill toolkit? And I'm asking the same question, because what it seems like is, with this change, you could come in and build a site out entirely with infill toolkit detached housing forms. You could build an entire plat with small houses, all detached, but you couldn't build an entire plat that might be able to achieve the exact same underlying density with traditional single family homes. And so it really is a push to the toolkit in a sense. I like the term she used there, because what we're saying is, if you want to build detached product and you can meet the minimum densities with a design to do that, you have to use the toolkit to do it. And I think that, and I'd be corrected if I'm wrong, but that was my interpretation when I read it. And so I asked the same question, and I echoed the same concern regarding the functionality of the toolkit. And I also appreciate, in the same way, what you said, Kurt, about that being updated, because I think I think we should call a spade and admit that this is basically forcing detached units to the toolkit housing form if they want to develop in a multifamily zone. And then we should switch gears and say, let's really fix and make that a functional thing to do, because the underlying problem is in the toolkit itself. So I don't know if there's a comment on that, but I asked the same question. I'd be curious why we think that small, is it because we think those are going to be cheaper? Is that why we want to do them versus like a bunch of 2,000 square foot homes? And so I'm curious about that. I'd like staff to comment more on that.
Well, I'll start. The whole genesis of the toolkit, I think you're well aware, was to provide more affordable home forms because they're smaller. And the whole purpose of having multifamily zoning is to achieve multifamily zoning, whether it's in the density of separate units. If you can make it that way, that's great. Or if it's combined wall, that's great. Either way, it meets that public purpose of affordability and choice. And I think that's the bottom line. As you said, call a spade. The challenge we have is our land that was reserved for multifamily, where we have a community that preserves a significant amount of single family and doesn't allow it to be altered. If your multifamily can't develop with those higher densities and get greater affordability, if it's swallowed up with just the same chock-a-block single-family development that's in the single-family neighborhoods, you've lost the opportunity. Where are you going to find it? because we can't achieve it at the densities in the urban villages. We need actually to look to these lands to make that choice, that slot in the market. So I guess that's the big overview here. So that's the conundrum we faced. We've wrestled as a team trying to find out the best way to do it. It's a fair critique. Why are you setting these numbers? Why are you trying to do it? We're trying to find a balance to allow for greater flexibility, because it is important, but still get the end product. The last part, the last three phases of that plat shouldn't be the only place we get the density if they're not going to occur.
Yeah, and I think, you know, one other component that I would add to that is that what we have found, and this is why the toolkit, we have the forms of the detached single family forms in the toolkit. What makes those work at higher densities is design. It's really, really important that when you're building at a higher density, you have to have a higher level of design. And what we have seen in some cases is that we have a housing form, a standard single family home, 2,500 square foot, that is now trying to be built on a 2,500 or 3,000 square foot lot. And that scale doesn't work without some sort of design component associated with it. So we believe, and we understand that housing form is something that's wanted, it's desired, it's needed in our community. Ultimately, we believe that the single family form and housing can be built and accomplished in our single family zones. But we also realize that it needs to happen elsewhere. Again, one of the main goals of this was to try to find a balance in ensuring that we achieve the densities that are out there, providing additional housing form, which we believe has that opportunity again to help with affordability, and that size and scale all has the opportunity to help with affordability. It's not this project is not going to solve our affordable housing concerns and issues. There was also one other question about the 25%. Where did it come from? Why that number? And actually, we do have a reason where we came from. It's currently utilized in some of our residential single zones. Some of our residential single zones allow 25% multifamily units within that zone. So what we did is we said, well, let's try to be consistent with our other rules and regulations. And we took, we're allowing 25% multifamily in some single family zones. So we felt it was appropriate to allow 25% single family, standard detached single family in our multifamily zones. So that's where that number came from, the 25%. And again, I just want to clarify that it's the 25% is the standard single family detached that you can build up to 5,500 square feet, 35 foot tall. It's all of the remaining, potentially you could have 25% straight single family and then 75% single family in the smaller homes. So you could have a development that's completely all 100% detached single family form. But as they get into those smaller areas, we believe that it's just more important to have that extra design component that goes along with it.
Thanks, Kurt. Mike, can I ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
I appreciate both your comments about this and the comments, Kurt, about design, because that is a significant difference, is the ability to administer design standards in the toolkit versus the other. And I guess I'm not sure if it's fully baked yet with that number, because I'm concerned about like the example you just used. You could still build a project that was entirely detached single family. And in hearing what Rick's talking about, the intent is to try and get more of the other housing forms. I'm just wondering if it might be like a better approach to require some minimum component of multifamily that's more dense, so we truly get a mix, because using this approach, we still could build an entirely detached project and present ourselves with the same issues that Rick identified about neighborhoods then all of a sudden being in opposition to a project. So I'm wondering if it's just better to look at it the other way, because there could be other internal conflicts. I was thinking about doing like a cluster subdivision we have a couple projects that I've seen that have a cluster subdivision using the infill toolkit in an RM zone. You get a 50% bonus if you do that. So you can actually increase your density by doing that, but 50% of the units can be single family. So would that even be allowed? And maybe I'm thinking through this wrong, but are we like creating a conflict between the ability to get a 50% bonus by doing a cluster toolkit subdivision because we can only have 25% of the units as traditional housing forms, or are we not creating a conflict? We're just kind of squeezing, again, the housing form flexibility in that scenario. So I told everybody I'd get wonky, and I'm thinking about some very specific scenarios, but I understand the intent. I guess I'll just say I understand the intent of what you're trying to accomplish, and I agree completely with the intent of creating mixed housing forms and trying to ensure that we get as much as we can. I just wonder if that number is necessary and if it needs to be thought through more.
Yeah, no, as I mentioned in the presentation, we believe that this is a starting point. We believe it's a good one. We'd be happy if it went forward in this manner. We believe it meets the goals of our comprehensive plan as well as the project. But we also understand that when we bring something through a legislative process, it's a starting point.
Yeah, I struggled with the 25% thing too. I was thinking some of what Rick said of, we reserve of our residential land, residential single and residential multi, 70% of it is set aside for residential single. And so we're already starting with this map of the orange areas that looks very arbitrary. And, you can't, there's all those opportunities, like those location specific criteria, what we ended up not using here to give density bonuses. There's a lot of areas that are residential single that are within that location efficient criteria map, close to parks, schools, grocery stores, transit. But you can't build a duplex there. And so you can't switch it around. And so if every time we get a single family house detached built in a greenfield multifamily, it's like we're a majority renter city and absurd majority single family zoning. It just feels backwards. And I understand the push for trying to reserve these areas for attached shared wall housing forms when that's not available anywhere else. I had another question, if there's no hands up right now. The Cordata PUD thing, can we get a little backstory on why Cordata is weird and has like things you don't see other places? I know just like a little bit of how like it's coming in from the annexation stuff, but like if part of like the comment we got about why is that not like if we're saying everything's going to these three groups and we're standardizing residential multi across the whole city, except Cordata is please see attached PDF. What's the story there and why is that weird?
Well, I'll start this off, but then I will turn it over to our resident Cordata expert, Ms. Bell, on this. She'll be able to tell you the whole story. But generally, we did receive the comment letter and from Ms. Veldman. And originally, when we evaluated this, we believed that it was a pretty complex. The PUD is a very complex document associated with it. But upon further recent review of that document, we believe that we can make some changes that would line it up with the rest of the project proposal. So I think that we can respond to Ms. Feldman's concerns through it. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kathy.
Mike, you ask good questions, and there's oftentimes that we are asking ourselves that same question, like all the time. We inherited the Cordata PUD when it was annexed to the city. It was an annexation agreement that we would honor the county prepared land use approvals. And within that, please keep in mind that some of it is still from the 1980s. And so we're really dealing with some very atypical land use. And we have been able to implement that PUD and to see that through. And I can honestly say that there are very few parcels remaining to be developed. And where development is possible, as Ms. Veldman testified tonight, there are some very unique opportunities that have formed since the PUD was approved through legislative actions by the city, such as the park and such as a mixed-use area that has unlimited density that we allowed to be separate from Cordata's density limitation. So this is the only area in the city that I'm aware of that has within its land use regulations a specified minimum density by a number that says Cordata PUD shall not exceed this number. So we looked at that and we really asked ourselves at the time, do we really want to go into this and to try to figure it out? Because there will be some additional analysis. And we've done a little bit of that to feel very confident that we can make these changes and put Cordata into a density range that is being proposed in the rest of our multifamily zoned areas. And we will be presenting that to you most likely next time, I would guess. It's Cordata. It has its blessings and its curses. And there will be a day when maybe there will be a thing of the past, but we're not there yet.
Okay, thanks. That's yeah, that's interesting. I will look for that revision at the next meeting. Jed, you're up.
So it seems like a lot of multifamily projects that you'll see around town, the limiting factor is maybe not so much what's allowed for the density. It's like, how do you do the parking for the development? And so I think there's a lot of like push for like, we would love to have structured parking wherever we can, but you know, most of these developments are just a math equation of what makes sense in terms of the rental rates and how much it costs to build something. So at this point, you don't see a lot of structured parking just because it's not feasible within the business plan of the developer. So I'm just wondering, you know, in terms of kind of what we're looking at with unlimited density, are we looking for a scenario where we see a lot more structured parking in order to get more density? Or do we see that this is still going to be kind of the world of surface parking and we're going to look at increasing density by reducing what is currently required by the zoning code for parking requirements?
I guess I'll start maybe, I don't know, Kathy, if you want to comment a little bit on this as well. We have heard that development regulations are a concern at meeting density. It's not the first time I've heard it. The Planning Commission has mentioned it in the past. We believe that there are changes that will be needed in the future. We think that this is a first step in getting there. We have parking has been added to our, you know, just to explore parking has been added to our work program. Unfortunately, right now, due to other high priority issues and the pandemic last year, we had to modify our work program a little bit. But parking is something that we definitely believe that we need to continue to do an analysis on, and that it's something that we will work on. And right now, we do understand that a lot of those other factors will, I guess, if you want to say it, limit the type of development, the scale. We have other development standards that already do that. We've got height limits that already kind of limit that scale as well. So we understand that there are other development regulations that probably need to be analyzed, but we felt like we couldn't do all of it in one project. So we said, let's start with the RM zones. Let's get it set up so that we've got opportunity there. And then let's go back in at future dates and do the updates to some of those things. Kathy, I don't know if you have other comments on that.
I think the other thing that I would add to that is that in the multifamily zones where purely multifamily development is being proposed, we're actually seeing a lot of development that is achieving the maximum density. And we're also seeing a lot of development that is obtaining density bonuses. So, and those are sites that are encumbered with critical areas or, you know, other natural features, topography, et cetera, and they are developing with surface parking. So we're seeing choices, and we're also seeing limitations, but we're also seeing a lot of success in developers being able to maximize their sites and actually going above and beyond what the maximum zoning is right now. So I don't think the push, Jed, is to force everybody into structured parking because we're not seeing that right now at projects that are achieving density and or getting density bonuses.
Rose?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch base on so incentives, and to follow up. I know that there is a desire to see more permanently affordable homes, and I know that this project isn't designed to fix that. And when you have unlimited density, what is the thought on how do we incentivize affordability and permanently affordability, like the capital A affordable, when you have those kinds of, when you don't have density as an incentive?
I'll start with that. And we're all pausing. We're kind of like those penguins on the ice floe. Someone has to get pushed in the water. So I guess the challenge on it is that, inclusionary zoning is long been shown as a means where you build 100 units and 10 of them would be permanently affordable. But it has to pencil to make that happen. And the most recent study that was done here showed that we just don't build at the scale that would pencil. And it does create kind of a problematic issue because you end up with fractional units, very small contributions that have to be assembled, and then someone has to build it. But those studies are about 5 or 6 years old, and the economics have changed, and it probably is right for us, we've talked about it, to look again to whether inclusionary housing is feasible in our market based on the number of units built in, and would not be actually an obstacle getting housing built. That's one way. There's a lot of things that come on in terms of in the future. Right now, government provides housing for the most challenged, folks who are 80% or lower of median. And we're able to provide housing and fund that. The question is whether as a community, we're going to step forward and you'll see government start looking to do market rate housing purely to provide the affordable choice. That's something that's probably in a 10-year horizon, something we'll see. Because I think at this point, the wages aren't rising fast enough for folks to be able to capitalize to purchase in our market. And we have a whole economic development chapter that talks about how we're going to try to change that, but that takes time. So I think you'll see a greater push in my crystal ball in housing markets that are very challenged to see more government involvement in affordable for 100% of median, or perhaps even higher.
Thank you.
Scott?
Thanks, Mike. Could staff begin probably to talk about some of the biggest changes in the document where there's, in this document, blue lines crossed out, major modifications or entire sections deleted completely in the official draft that would have the biggest impact on our community or on the density, whether for good or for bad?
I think a lot of the strikeout that you see, the large chunks of strikeout, it's actually just being relocated from one section in the code. So we have to delete it in one section of the code, and then we copy and paste it and put it in another section of the code. So where you're seeing large areas of strikeout, that's actually what's happening. And the planned is a perfect example. Before, when you were doing residential multi-development, you had to go to multiple places throughout our code. One was this planned section. So what we've done is we've deleted all of the residential multi section out of the planned code section, and we put it into the residential multiple section. So it's just moving that. When we do code changes, we have to do it in what's known as legislative format, and that's the strikeout and the underline. So most of that you're seeing is cleanup, making it easier to understand and to see. Now, there are some changes that are happening, most notably the density, really kind of talking about what density is and how it's calculated. And then having the categories, our comprehensive plan categories, now pulled into our zoning code is a pretty big change as well. So before, areas had a 5,000 square foot minimum or density requirement. Now, instead of having that very specific 5,000, it's going to say it's a medium category. So we took, and Kate may be able to correct me on this, but like 93 different zones that had different specific numbers in that density category, and now it's converted into that range. So you're only seeing low, medium, or high. Those, I think, ultimately, those are really the biggest changes that's out there. And then obviously the toolkit, allowing the entire toolkit form in that transition zone, which used to more limited housing forms there.
Thanks, Kurt.
Back to Ollie.
Thanks, Mike. I had a question about the RM low. In past meetings, I think, Kate, you'd implied that there's maybe only like 5 or so properties or little areas that are RM low. Is that right? They're pretty limited?
There are 5 sub areas. There's more properties within each sub area, but 5 sub areas.
And then, okay, thank you. And then in the staff report, in tonight's staff report, there was reference to those areas being pretty much built out. I think it implied.
Yeah, there's limited
potential
vacant land, actually totally vacant land there.
I wonder if, and I've talked about this in past meetings, but really at 7,200 square feet or higher, it's not really multifamily zoning in general. It's not multifamily density. It's more of a single family size, in my opinion. I mean, a lot of our single family neighborhoods are 5,000 square foot, so it's larger. Is there any reason to even have the RM low is my question? It seems like it's a relic. And I think the staff report also implied that we would never designate any future areas with a similar zoning designation. So this is maybe just a question for staff. Like, was there consideration for finding some other alternative that preserved what those 5 sub areas have, but just eliminated the RM low entirely? And the reason I ask that is because we've created this whole section that we've acknowledged we're never going to add more property to. So it's dead. It's created solely for those areas. And it delivers a message that density is residential multi in nature, which it's not. And so eliminating entirely, finding a way to incorporate those 5 sub areas into one of the other designations, to me, feels like it might be a more appropriate approach to those few areas, and also more consistent with the goals that we've talked about in this ordinance. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, we did have a lot of discussion about the RM low zones. We also had a lot of discussion about the RM medium zone and whether or not that needed to be divided. So we had lots of discussions about it. much of that was came from the Planning Commission discussion on it. We felt that that seemed to be more of a comprehensive plan perspective and change, because right now we have those categories within that comprehensive plan, and we felt that it was a much more appropriate discussion when we updated our comprehensive plan the next go around. So I think at that time, we'll do more analysis into those subcategories, the high, medium, low. Right now it's the same for residential single and for residential multi. Perhaps in our comp plan update, we look at changing that, getting rid of the low designation for our residential multi zones, and then maybe we split it up a little bit more. So we just felt that that was more appropriately done at a larger level and at that comp plan update stage.
Thanks, Kurt. That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Scott, you have another comment?
Question, actually, when it comes to the neighborhood plan documentation, it's extensive and detailed. It seems like it pulls out certain areas, micro areas of the community, and recognizes that what's above in the draft may not work in these certain areas. Something is nuanced, such as a school or a transition area that really shouldn't be designated with a higher density. How legally binding are some of these summaries, and are these concerns going to affect people in a negative fashion, or could it benefit them? And also, how are the neighborhood plans modified? Do they have to go back to the neighborhood associations, or does the city do it themselves? And a little bit more information on all that.
I think I'd look to one of our long rangers to maybe talk a little bit about the neighborhood plans and how they're modified or changed.
Yeah, I can talk about that. So our neighborhood plans are modified by the Planning Commission, makes a recommendation, and the City Council ultimately makes changes to neighborhood plans. So no, they don't have to go to neighborhood associations.
So then the binding of it, it seems like you put a lot of effort into this. It seems like there's some really important concerns in some of these neighborhoods. Are they binding? I've heard that neighborhood plans are kind of just a suggestion. So if these concerns are really valid, how do we make sure that our residents are cared for with these concerns that you've already brought to our attention?
I think what you're getting at is there's other information included in the ordinance other than the changes. What you're seeing a lot of is existing information. The only thing we changed in the neighborhood plans were dealing with the RM project, very narrow, specific changes. All of that other text was already there. And the neighborhood plans are part of the city's comprehensive plan. That's why we had to go through the docketing process to add it to the annual list of comprehensive plan amendments.
I think now you're talking my language, Scott, because it transitions from the documents and how they are, how they do, and actually how they work. So whenever we get a development regulation, it's the first thing we do is we go to it's located in Area 5 of the Puget neighborhood. So the first thing that we do when we get this development application is we go and we read in the neighborhood plan Area 5 of the Puget neighborhood. That gives us the context in which we evaluate that permit in. So if you've got a planned development permit or a conditional use permit or something like that, we look to those development, the neighborhood plans to help us understand and to guide any special conditions or something that come with that development. So it's, there are broad documents that some are very specific. And when we are doing development review, we do utilize those and read them as before we make our decisions.
Could you then speak to why in some of the neighborhood plans, the density went from medium to high? even though we had the same ranges as before. It's just instead of numbers, we're using low, medium, and high, such as Sunnyland, South Hill, they changed from medium density to high density.
I can't speak specifically to that. Yeah, you can give me a minute to pull that section or that
Page
up.
165.
Yeah, is it? It's the zoning table. Is that the one you're?
No, this is actually in the neighborhood plans themselves. And I'm just wondering why the density would change when it seemed like it was about simplicity, not to change the density in these areas.
Yeah, so in some of our zones and some of our residential multi-sub-area zones, there are a multitude of densities. So it would say detached single family, 5,000 square feet. It would say duplex, 2,500 square feet per unit. So there was a range of different types of density dependent upon the type of development that occurred there. And what we did is we looked at, well, what is the density intended for this area? And we looked at the comprehensive plan designation. So remember, there's a difference. The comprehensive plan designation is already established at a high, medium, or low. That's in the neighborhood plan. Then once you get into the zoning tables, that's where you get into that more specific, that 5,000 or that 3,000, depending on that type of unit. So what we're doing is we're making the zoning tables not as specific, and we're lining them up with the comprehensive plan and the neighborhood plans right now and their designation. So it's already designated a high or a low or a medium in the neighborhood plans. It's now designated that same category in the zoning tables. And when we had that range of zoning, what we did is we looked at, well, what was the intent behind that? And if it was that higher per unit count, that's where we went with it.
Okay, thanks, Kurt.
And I think to add to that, when in one of the work sessions with the Planning Commission, we asked the question in establishing these ranges that if there was a density bonus that was allowed that would take a project to the high density, should we make them high or should we put them as medium? And your guys' recommendation was to take them to high. And we went back and revisited that, and we've already reported this out to you, that it is probably more realistic to be medium, but still to keep the density bonus so that they could still achieve a higher density. But to be consistent with the neighborhood plans, or to make the zoning tables and the neighborhood plans consistent, we did take away some of the high density designations and to make them medium. But that doesn't mean they still can't go to high density. It's just that their density range is in the medium category. Does that help?
It does. It's just in my experience here, my examples, it went from medium to high instead of from high to medium.
Yes, they go. There are many that go both ways.
Okay.
And we'll take a closer look at that specific to the areas you identified. What I can say is it's not in anyone's best interest. You really don't get very much. It's marginal gains to have 96 different designations. It really doesn't appear that way on the ground. Low, medium, high makes more sense and more predictability, and it's less confusing for folks. So I don't think you lose very much by trying to group them, but you're fair to ask, what did we use when we pushed them? You know, what were the criterion we used to push them to high, medium, or low? And we'll take a look at that.
Dr. Ali again.
Hey, thanks, Mike. I just had a follow-up on Scott's question about that for Kathy. And I just want to make sure I'm understanding the explanation you gave, because I think I do. So what you're saying is in those areas where you had, I saw one example I was looking at in the table was like, say the density was 4,000 or 4,200 with a bonus to 1,800, that the base is in the medium and the bonus puts you in the high. You guys chose, it appears you chose to leave the base as medium, but preserve the opportunity to get the bonus, the same bonus in that zoning table. Is that what you chose to kind of do throughout the document?
Yes,
Okay.
because otherwise, if you think about it from the perspective that the bonus right now is an option. It's an option for them to develop at a higher density. If we would have made those high densities, it would have now been a requirement for them to develop at that higher density because the minimums in the high now become $35.99.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that actually, Scott's question was leading to the question I had, which is correlated, which is what happens in the scenario where you are, I commented on like a cluster subdivision. In our subdivision code, you're allowed to get there's a variety of things you can do to get a 50% bonus, affordable housing, infill toolkit, various things. What happens in the scenario where now you're in a medium zone and you do a cluster subdivision, which provides you the opportunity of 50% bonus? What do you base that bonus from? You get to go to the 3,600 because you're in the medium and say, I get 50% bonus on the max density in the medium?
Yes.
Does that question make sense?
Yes.
Is that what you would do? So basically, if you're looking at those bonuses contained in the subdivision ordinance, you would it would really only apply in the medium scenario, or maybe the low or the medium, and you would be able to bump up from the maximum within that range.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And if I can respond to Scott's questions a little bit, I believe in some of the areas that you mentioned, there was a multifamily density per unit, and there was also a single family lot size. And when we look at the multifamily density, it was in the high category. And so we changed the neighborhood plan to be consistent with what the multifamily density is, which is high. So the neighborhood plan listed it medium to high. And because the multifamily density would be in the high range, that is why we changed the neighborhood plan to the high density as well. And there are a few areas where that occurred.
Other questions or comments? Go ahead.
Sorry, Mike, one more. Kurt, you gave an answer to a question earlier that Jed asked about, why we didn't tackle some of the other barriers to achieving density within the code that are contained within the standards, like parking, for example. And I know you mentioned that had been talked about before. I know I'm guilty of that, bringing that up before. Is that just a closed door in this process entirely? Because I saw that you chose to dig in a little bit into that section of code when you talked about height. And I actually really appreciate that the city and planning staff are continuing to create consistency in the presentation of the information. Like the fact that you shifted all that stuff to table format, while it might seem like a minor thing, you've been doing that consistently with all these ordinances. It's much easier to read. It's nice to see consistency throughout all the different land use codes. But I noticed that you took the time to like redo that whole table. So we're doing the drafting work. We changed the height. Is everything else off the table, or is there any opportunity for us to like ask for you to address some of those other standards through this exercise? I know you said earlier no, but I guess I'm like asking nicely if we can tackle something else.
Yeah, I know. Well, I think the height was a very unique one. It was because you had this conflict in this establishment of height based on density. And when we changed the density to the category, we couldn't just leave it. We had to differentiate it somehow. And so that was the one reason that we went into the height category. Honestly, and this is something that I've said before, is that if we try to change too much with this project, we're afraid that it's going to get really bogged down in some of the minutia. And parking can be a very, very emotional topic. And if all of a sudden we get kind of wrapped around parking, we lose kind of the gains and the benefits that we would achieve on getting just the RM categories in place. So we believe that there's going to be the potential for significant impact on, just the range zoning system. And for this project to kind of get boiled down and maybe some of that minutia of a bulk and scale discussion or a parking discussion, we just really felt that it was important to keep those items and those concepts separate. We acknowledge that our zoning code needs to have updates to it. We understand that it needs to happen. It just can't all happen with one project. So that's kind of where we landed on that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's a fair answer. And I think parking is like the hot button ticket, item that always generates the most controversy. So I appreciate that. I want us to go there, even if it was other things that also impact it, like our setbacks and our usable open space. We find those two particular standards to be very restrictive when we work on the design of projects. And the plan zone, for example, has much better regulations on some of those. So, you look at a multi-zone, you look at a plan zone, and you say, gosh, I wish I was in a plan zone on this site, not multi, because I have these silly setbacks I have to deal with. And Kathy, to your point, you're right. I think we are getting, you commented earlier that we're getting sites that are building out or asking for bonuses. So we are achieving that, but if we're going to open it up in the high zone, for example, and give people unlimited, people are going to take advantage of that. That's a big gift that the city is giving these people. And I think it's a good thing, but people are going to start butting up against those standards as they try to accomplish what you want us to accomplish, which is fit more. And particularly when we get into the multifamily zones that are more urbanized, like not on the north end, because that's where we really struggle with these things in our more core multifamily areas. And we're getting there, but we're getting there with waivers, on every project, which implies that the code is, not working. So we're struggling with that. So I know you want to change. This is my appeal to our council members who might be listening. I know you've empowered staff to leave no stone unturned. And I think that many people in the community who work in these codes have identified that there's problems. And I think staff has identified there's problems. And I think everybody involved would love to see these issues resolved. And if we empower staff to tackle these things with time and effort, we're going to get closer to accomplishing what we set out to accomplish. This is a fantastic step forward. Don't take this the wrong way as a criticism of this step. It's a fantastic step, but we need to empower you guys to spend the resource and time on that and step up and back you up when you're confronted with the pushback that you alluded to, Kurt, because it is a big lift and it's going to generate controversy. And so I would encourage anyone listening to support that effort. I know it's not going to be part of this, but we need to go there.
Okay, if there's no other hands, and there's what our process looks like another hearing on June 10th. Is that?
Yes.
Where we're going from here?
Yes.
And we could expect maybe some minor changes, responses to things we've talked about tonight.
Yes, we'll review all of the comments, both from the public and from the commission, and reevaluate and let you know on the 10th if we, as a result of that comment or comments, are recommending any changes at this point.
Okay, sounds good. Well, with that, we'll close the public hearing. Heather or staff, do we have any other business? Do you want to give us a refresher on the next couple of weeks schedule?
Yeah, I can do that. June 3rd will be the public hearing on the City View project. And that should be a lively evening. And then of course, June 10th, we come back to this RM project. And then on June 17th, we'll have 3 public hearings on the code amendments that Rick previewed for you at your last meeting. So we're getting fairly busy. Reserve your Thursday nights because there's a lot of work coming your way, and then it's all good stuff. And appreciate everyone tonight. I know this is sort of sausage making, a lot of detail, and we appreciate your sticking with it and asking great questions and providing great comments. That helps us in our process. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you all. Go ahead, Ollie.
Were you going to wrap it up, Mike?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say it was brought to my attention earlier that this is Lisa's last presentation to us. And so I wanted to say thanks, Lisa, because over the past, I don't know how many years on Planning Commission, we've had a lot of presentations from you and a lot of ordinances presented from you. And I always appreciated your presentation of the information and the way you gave us feedback and helped us out. And so I just want to say thank you. We'll miss you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Seconded.
Yeah.
Second.
Yes, you guys too. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Alrighty. On that note, we'll go ahead and end tonight's meeting. Thanks, everyone.